I remember the exact moment the road stopped looking like a road and started looking like a mistake, because the gravel thinned out into two pale tire tracks cutting through tall grass, and my friend Lucas leaned forward in the passenger seat like he always did when he was trying to convince himself something was still a good idea, and he said, "This is it, right?" While the forest closed in around us on both sides so tightly it felt like the trees were leaning over the truck to watch us pass. And I told him, yeah, this matched the directions I'd downloaded before we lost signal back near the highway. A service road that led to an old ranger station deep inside the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. The kind of place nobody uses anymore except the occasional backcountry ranger doing fire season. And that was the whole point of our trip. 3 days camping somewhere remote where we wouldn't see another person. Just the three of us in the woods. Me, Lucas, and Trevor in the backseat scrolling through the photos he'd been taking out the window since we left town. And at first everything about it felt normal. The late afternoon sun cutting through tall pine trunks, the smell of dust and sap through the open windows, the way the forest got quieter the deeper we drove. Like the world behind us was slowly being sealed off. And then about 20 minutes down that narrowing road, we saw the first sign something was wrong. A truck parked sideways across a pull-off, like someone had left in a hurry. Driver door wide open, nobody around. The engine cold when Lucas touched the hood out of habit, and Trevor joked maybe someone had gone hiking, but there was no trailhead, no markers. Just a rusted metal sign half buried in weeds that read, "Ranger Station 2 miles, arrow pointing further down the road." And I remember standing there, listening, and realizing how completely silent the forest had become. Not even birds, just wind moving high in the branches, like distant surf. And Lucas said we should keep going, because it wasn't our truck, and it wasn't our problem. So we got back in and drove past it. But I kept checking the rearview mirror, long after the open door disappeared behind the trees. And the road eventually ended in a small clearing where the ranger station sat. A squat wooden building on stilts, with a metal roof, and a wraparound porch that sagged slightly in the middle, like it had been holding its breath for years. And the whole place looked abandoned in a way that felt heavier than just being unused, like it had been forgotten deliberately. But the weirdest thing was the generator shed beside it, because the padlock had been cut clean through and the door hung open just a few inches, swaying gently in the breeze. And Trevor pointed that out right away, saying someone had definitely been here recently. But Lucas shrugged it off, said hunters probably broke in, looking for fuel or tools. And honestly, I wanted to believe that explanation, because the alternative was harder to define, but easier to feel. So we unloaded our gear and set up our tents near the tree line, while the sun dropped behind the mountains, and the woods started doing what woods always do at night, filling slowly with small sounds that grow louder the darker it gets. Branches shifting, insects humming, the occasional crack deeper in the forest that might be an animal, or might be nothing. And by the time we got a fire going, the sky was already dark enough that the ranger station behind us was just a black shape against the stars. And Lucas suggested we check inside before bed in case there were old supplies or at least a solid roof if the weather turned bad. So the three of us walked up onto the porch with flashlights, and the boards creaked in a way that echoed out into the trees like a warning, and the front door opened with barely any resistance, like it hadn't been properly shut in years. And inside it smelled like dust and old wood, and something faintly metallic that reminded me of pennies. The room mostly empty except for a rusted stove, a desk pushed against the far wall, and a narrow hallway leading deeper into the building. And Trevor found a logbook on the desk, covered in a layer of grime, but the last page had been written on only a few weeks earlier, which made Lucas laugh nervously because supposedly this station hadn't been staffed since the early 2000s, and the handwriting wasn't official ranger stuff either. Just short entries, like someone killing time. The same sentence repeated over and over across 3 pages. He keeps coming back at night. And Trevor joked it sounded like the start of a creepypasta. But I noticed the final entry ended mid-sentence, like the pen had been dragged off the paper in a hurry. And none of us said anything about that for a moment, until Lucas finally closed the book and said, "We were overthinking it and should get back to the fire." And that's when we heard the first sound from the forest. A single sharp crack of a branch somewhere beyond the clearing, loud enough that all three of us turned toward the doorway at the same time. Flashlights pointing out into darkness, where the trees stood like a wall just beyond the edge of the clearing, and we waited maybe 30 seconds expecting to hear an animal moving away, but instead there was nothing, just that heavy quiet again, and Lucas said probably a deer, but his voice sounded thinner than before. And when we stepped back outside, the fire had burned lower, and the clearing looked different somehow, like the darkness had moved closer while we were inside, so we sat around the flames for a while. Longer trying to act normal. Trevor telling stories about a camping trip he'd taken with his uncle when he was a kid. Lucas poking at the fire with a stick. Me staring into the tree line without really meaning to. And after a while I noticed something that made my stomach tighten in a way I still remember clearly. Because at first I thought it was just my eyes adjusting to the dark. But the longer I looked, the more certain I became that one of the trees at the edge of the clearing wasn't a tree at all. It was too narrow, too straight, and it seemed to shift slightly when the firelight flickered. And I told myself it was just a dead trunk, or a broken branch leaning upright, until Lucas suddenly said, "Did you guys move the cooler?" And we all looked down, because the red cooler we'd left beside the truck was now about 10 feet closer to the forest than it had been before, and none of us had touched it. And that's when the sound came again, another branch snapping deeper in the trees, followed by a slow, deliberate rustling, like something heavy moving just beyond the reach of our light. And Lucas stood up immediately, shining his flashlight toward it, calling out, "Hello?" in that forced, confident tone people use when they're actually nervous. But the beam only illuminated layers of pine needles and trunks stretching away into darkness. And then from somewhere out there, not far, maybe 20 yards inside the tree line, a man's voice answered, calm and flat and almost bored, saying, "You boys shouldn't be here." And the strange thing wasn't just hearing another person that far out in the wilderness. It was the way he said it, like he'd been watching us for a long time already. And Lucas asked who he was, but the voice didn't respond right away. We just heard another slow step in the leaves, closer now. And Trevor whispered that we should probably get in the truck and leave. But before anyone moved, the voice spoke again, from a slightly different spot in the dark, and said, "The last ones didn't listen either." And I remember the exact moment the fear settled in, because Lucas swung his flashlight across the trees trying to find whoever was talking, and for just a second, the beam caught a figure standing between two trunks. A tall man, wearing what looked like an old ranger jacket, completely still, face hidden by shadow, and then he stepped sideways behind the tree and vanished like he'd never been there at all. And Lucas started walking toward the forest without thinking, calling out again, but Trevor grabbed his arm and said, we needed to go right now, and as we backed toward the truck, the cooler moved again, scraping softly across the dirt, like something unseen had nudged it from the other side. And the voice came once more from somewhere behind us now, closer to the ranger station than the woods, which made no sense because we hadn't seen anyone pass us. And it said quietly, almost sympathetically, "You should have turned around at the road." And when we spun toward the porch, our flashlights caught the front door of the ranger station, slowly swinging open, even though none of us had gone back inside. And in the yellow beam of Lucas's light, we saw fresh footprints in the dust on the porch floor leading into the building that definitely hadn't been there earlier. They're human footprints, like someone had walked out of the forest and straight into the station while we were sitting at the fire. And the last thing I clearly remember before everything started moving too fast was realizing those footprints were still wet, leaving dark marks across the old wood, as if whoever made them had just stepped out of a nearby stream, except the nearest water on our map was almost 3 miles away. I didn't originally plan to spend the night at the ranger station in the Mojave National Preserve, but plans have a way of dissolving out there once the sun drops behind those black volcanic hills and the desert starts feeling less like empty land and more like a giant listening space where every sound travels forever. And the truth is, the whole trip had already started going wrong before I even turned off the main road, because my two friends, Mark and Daniel, had been arguing since late afternoon about whether we should push deeper into the preserve or just camp near the visitor area. And Mark was the stubborn type who believed the whole point of coming to a place like that was to get far enough away from people that the sky felt bigger than the ground. So when we found the dirt road leading toward an old ranger station listed on an outdated map Daniel downloaded months earlier, Mark insisted we check it out, saying it would be perfect because nobody would bother driving that far at night. And the road itself looked like it hadn't been graded in years, just a narrow trail of pale dust winding through scrub and scattered Joshua trees. And the deeper we drove, the more the land flattened into this endless open basin, surrounded by low mountains that looked like jagged silhouettes against a fading orange sky. And I remember glancing at the fuel gauge and realizing we probably shouldn't be wandering too far without cell signal. But by then, Mark was already talking about astrophotography and how incredible the stars would look out there. And eventually the headlights caught the shape of the ranger station sitting alone on a slight rise, a small concrete building with boarded windows and a radio antenna leaning sideways like it had been bent by years of wind. And the place looked abandoned but not ancient, more like something people had simply stopped caring about, which somehow felt worse. And when we stepped out of the truck, the silence was immediate and overwhelming, the kind that presses into your ears until you start hearing your own breathing louder than anything else. And Daniel muttered that he didn't like the vibe, but Mark was already walking toward the building with his flashlight swinging lazily across the walls, pointing out the faded government lettering still visible above the door that read, "Ranger Station," in cracked black paint. And when he pushed the door open, it groaned, like the hinges were dry but it wasn't locked, which felt strange considering the boards on the windows suggested someone had tried to seal the place up. And inside there was a single large room with old desks, filing cabinets tipped over on their sides, and a radio console coated in dust thick enough that our footsteps left clear tracks across the floor. And I remember thinking it looked less like a place that had been abandoned, and more like a place someone had searched in a hurry. Drawers half open, paper scattered, a chair lying on its side near the far wall. And Daniel noticed the generator outside had fresh tire tracks around it that definitely weren't ours, because they led in from the opposite direction of the road we used, which immediately changed the mood in the room because it meant someone else had been here recently, even though the station was miles from anywhere. And Mark brushed it off, saying it was probably a Park Service truck. But there were no official vehicles outside, and the tracks looked too narrow anyway, more like an ATV or small pickup. And we ended up deciding to camp right beside the station so we could use the building as shelter if the wind picked up overnight, which in hindsight was the exact moment we should have left, because the desert at night does something strange to your sense of distance and direction. The darkness out there is so complete that the world beyond your flashlight just disappears. And once the sun was gone, a temperature dropped fast, and the wind started whispering across the basin, carrying these faint shifting noises that could have been sand moving, or animals miles away, or something else entirely. And for a while everything felt normal again, as we sat beside a small lantern, eating canned chili and talking about stupid road trip memories. But around midnight, Daniel suddenly stopped mid-sentence and tilted his head toward the darkness behind the ranger station, asking if we heard an engine. And at first I didn't, but then there it was, extremely faint, like a vehicle idling somewhere far off in the desert where no road existed, just a low vibration carried through the still air. And Mark said, maybe it was another camper arriving, but the sound didn't get closer or farther away. It just stayed there humming somewhere beyond the hills. And after a few minutes it stopped completely, leaving the silence even heavier than before. And Daniel said he had a bad feeling and wanted to sleep in the truck with the doors locked. But Mark laughed it off and went inside the station to look around again, saying maybe there were old ranger logs or maps we could check out. And I followed him mostly because the lantern light outside suddenly felt too small against all that darkness, and the inside of the station had that stale desert smell, like warm dust and metal. And Mark was shining his light across the far wall when he noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. A corkboard covered with yellowing papers, and a single photograph pinned in the center, showing a group of rangers standing beside the building sometime in the 1980s, smiling in that stiff official way. But someone had drawn thick black lines across the faces with a marker, except for one man standing slightly behind the others near the doorway. And the longer we stared at the picture, the more uncomfortable it became, because that man's face hadn't been crossed out, and instead someone had written a single word beside him in shaky handwriting: "Still here." And Mark joked that maybe a bored vandal did it years ago. But the ink looked too fresh compared to the faded paper around it. And while we were standing there, Daniel suddenly called from outside, asking if we had moved the truck. And we both stepped back out onto the porch immediately, because the panic in his voice was obvious. And when we reached the lantern light, Daniel was pointing toward the vehicle, which had somehow rolled forward about 5 feet from where we parked it, angled slightly toward the open desert, like someone had pushed it. And Mark said maybe the ground wasn't level, but the engine was in park and the handbrake was on. And the more disturbing part was the set of footprints in the dust behind the truck, leading away from it into the darkness. Clear human shoe prints, heading out into the desert, where nothing existed for miles. And Daniel swore those hadn't been there earlier. And while we were still staring at them, the engine sound came back again. Louder this time, but still distant, like a vehicle slowly circling somewhere beyond the hills. And I remember feeling this sudden certainty that whoever made those tracks was still out there watching us from the dark, waiting. And Mark finally started to look uneasy too, suggesting maybe we should pack up and leave, even though it was after midnight. But the moment he said that, the lantern flickered violently in the wind and went out, plunging us into complete darkness except for our flashlights. And in that instant, the engine noise stopped again, replaced by something else much closer, the crunch of gravel behind a ranger station, as if someone had just stepped onto the ground there. And Daniel swung his light around the corner of the building while shouting hello, but the beam only revealed the blank desert stretching away under a sky full of stars. And then we heard a voice from somewhere near the antenna tower behind us, a low, calm voice that sounded oddly patient, saying, "You shouldn't stay after dark." And Mark demanded to know who was there, but the voice didn't answer right away. We just heard slow footsteps moving across the gravel toward the building, even though none of our lights could find the person making them. And Daniel whispered that we needed to get in the truck immediately. But as we hurried toward it, the headlights suddenly flashed on by themselves, even though the keys were still in Mark's pocket, illuminating the desert in front of us in a wide, pale beam. And in that light we saw another vehicle parked far out in the basin where there had been nothing earlier. An old white pickup sitting completely still with its engine off, facing directly toward the ranger station, as if it had been watching us the entire time. And standing beside it was a man, too far away to see clearly, but definitely facing us. Not moving, not waving, just standing there in the headlights, like he'd been waiting for us to notice him. And the voice came again from somewhere much closer than the truck, right beside the ranger station door now, whispering calmly into the dark. "He doesn't like when people try to leave." I was working a temporary seasonal job doing maintenance inspections across several remote ranger stations in Olympic National Park when the 3 campers disappeared. And the reason I know more about what happened than most people is because I was the last person who spoke to them before they hiked into the forest and never came back, which is something that still sits in the back of my mind every time I hear wind moving through tall cedar trees. Because Olympic is the kind of wilderness that feels ancient in a way that's hard to explain if you've never been there. The forests are so dense that daylight barely touches the ground in some places. The moss grows thick over everything, like nature trying to erase whatever humans build there. And the ranger station I had been assigned to check that week was one of the most isolated structures in the entire park. An old backcountry outpost, located miles down a narrow trail that wound along a river, and then disappeared into towering spruce and hemlock. And getting there required hiking almost 9 miles with a pack full of tools and radio batteries. So by the time I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky was already dimming beneath the canopy, even though it was still early evening, and the station itself looked exactly how these remote places usually do. A small log cabin on a raised foundation with a metal chimney, a shed beside it containing fuel and emergency gear, and a wooden sign that had been half swallowed by moss reading Ranger Station in faded letters. And everything felt quiet but normal, just the constant sound of the nearby river and the slow creaking of trees moving against each other high above. And I spent about an hour checking the structure, replacing a couple of radio batteries, and writing notes in the maintenance log, before stepping out onto the porch to eat a quick dinner while the forest darkened around me. And that's when I first heard voices coming down the trail. 3 men talking loudly, in the careless way people do when they think they're alone in the woods. And a few minutes later, they stepped into the clearing around the station, carrying backpacks and looking relieved to see the building, because according to them, they had been hiking most of the day, trying to reach a campsite marked on an outdated map that apparently didn't exist anymore. So they asked if they could pitch their tents near the station for the night. And, technically, I was supposed to discourage that unless there was an emergency. But honestly, the forest out there can get confusing, even for experienced hikers, and these guys looked exhausted and harmless enough. Probably mid-20s, just friends out on a weekend trip. So I told them they could camp near the tree line as long as they left early in the morning and packed out their trash. And they seemed grateful, introducing themselves as Aaron, Josh, and Tyler. And for the next hour or so, everything felt almost relaxing, because it's rare to run into people that far out, and the conversation broke the monotony of being alone in the woods for days at a time. They set up their tents while I brewed coffee on a small stove, and we sat on the porch talking about trails and wildlife, and how thick the forest felt compared to other parks. And I remember Aaron mentioning that they thought someone had been following them earlier on the trail because they kept hearing footsteps behind them that stopped whenever they turned around. But Josh laughed it off, saying it was probably just animals moving through the brush, and I agreed because Olympic is full of elk and black bears, and they can move quietly enough to make hikers paranoid. But the strange thing was that while we were sitting there talking, I kept hearing something faint out beyond the clearing too, the occasional snap of a twig or the slow rustle of ferns deeper in the trees. Subtle sounds that blended into the forest, but felt slightly out of rhythm with everything else. And at one point, Tyler actually stood up and shined his flashlight toward the trail, asking if someone else was out there. But the beam only revealed the thick wall of moss-covered trunks and tangled undergrowth that surrounded the station on all sides. And eventually we convinced ourselves it was just the normal background noise of the woods, and the conversation drifted to other things until the sky finally turned completely dark, which in that forest means pitch black, except for whatever small circle your flashlight creates. And around 10, the guys said they were turning in because they wanted to get an early start hiking out in the morning. So they headed to their tents while I went back inside the station to finish writing my inspection notes. And everything was quiet for maybe half an hour until I heard Aaron shouting from outside. Not screaming exactly, but calling out loudly like he was annoyed. And when I stepped onto the porch with my light, he was standing near the tree line, pointing toward the ground, saying something had moved their backpacks while they were brushing their teeth down by the river. And sure enough, the packs were sitting several feet away from where they had left them, beside the tents, dragged across the dirt like someone had pulled them slowly toward the woods. And Josh immediately accused Tyler of messing with them, but Tyler swore he hadn't touched anything. And while we were arguing about it, I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stand up, because there were footprints in the damp soil around the packs that didn't match any of our boots. Narrow, bare footprints like someone had been walking through the clearing without shoes, leading straight from the tree line to the gear and then back into the darkness again. And the weirdest part was how fresh they looked, the mud still glossy in the beam of my flashlight. And Aaron asked if there were any other rangers stationed nearby, but I told him the nearest one was miles away downriver, which is when the mood shifted from confusion to real unease, because none of us could explain who would be wandering barefoot through that forest in the middle of the night. And Josh suggested maybe a lost hiker had stumbled into camp and taken off again when he realized people were there. But that didn't make sense either, because the footprints ended abruptly at the edge of the clearing, without continuing onto the trail, just disappearing into a patch of ferns where the ground was too soft to hold clear prints. And after a long moment, Tyler quietly asked if he could sleep inside the ranger station instead of his tent. Which honestly I didn't blame him for, because something about those tracks felt wrong in a way that's hard to describe, unless you've spent enough time alone in the woods to trust your instincts. So I agreed they could all sleep inside if they wanted, and we moved their gear onto the porch while the forest around us seemed to grow even quieter than before, like everything out there was holding still and listening. And right as we finished carrying the last pack up the steps, we heard a single slow footstep somewhere beyond the clearing, the unmistakable sound of weight pressing down on leaves, followed by but the steps were too low, and realized one day that it was too dumb, moving in a wide circle around the station just outside the reach of our lights, and Aaron called out asking who was there. But there was no reply, just those deliberate steps continuing through the darkness, never rushing, never getting closer than the tree line, like whoever was out there knew exactly how far away to stay. And I remember gripping my flashlight tighter and realizing the radio inside a station probably wouldn't reach anyone at this distance anyway. And after a few minutes, the footsteps stopped completely, leaving us standing in silence until Josh nervously laughed and said, "Maybe we were spooking each other for no reason." But before anyone could answer, Tyler suddenly whispered, "Look," and pointed toward the side of the cabin where our lantern light barely touched the ground. And that's when we all saw another set of those same bare footprints, slowly appearing in the dirt, one after another, as if someone invisible was walking past the wall of the ranger station just inches from where we stood, the impressions forming in the soil without any visible person making them, leading calmly around the corner of the building toward the back door where the darkness was deepest. And the last thing Aaron said before everything went completely wrong was a quiet, confused sentence I still hear in my head sometimes when the forest gets too quiet, because he leaned closer to the prints and muttered, "Why are they wet?" Even though it hadn't rained for days, and the nearest water was the river almost a quarter mile away somewhere out in that black wall of trees.